Today is National Security, the Cost of American Militarism, featuring Mr. Mel Goodman. First of all, I'd like to thank Jim and Diane Cameron for their continued support of our World Affairs Council educational endeavors, Wells Fargo Private Bank for their generous corporate support, and as they say in NPR, all of our beautiful members. So, round of applause, please. Let's see, looking forward, our next event will feature Dr. Norman Finkelstein speaking on Israeli-Palestinian relations, here again at the Antlers, but at 5:30 on April 22nd. May, Sylvia told me, is chock full of CSWAC events. We have a bunch going on. A panel of EU consul generals in early May, also in the evening, a young professional event, as well as our final luncheon, but most importantly, circle your calendars on Thursday, May 29th, at the Cornerstone Arts Center at Colorado College will be our annual dinner. This is an event that we look forward to all year. This is where we're going to have an excellent discussion. We will have 4 different ethnicities represented in a culinary sense. There will be 4 food stops. There will also be performing arts and associated discussants talking about issues there. So it'll be a great event. Please consider it. Again, that's May 29th. And information will be on the website pretty soon. Let's see. So, in case you didn't know this, our speaker today does not hold back. Here's a glimpse of his January 2014 commentary on former Secretary of Defense Gates' book, Duty. Quoting, "Since I have known Bob Gates for nearly 50 years, working with him for more than a decade, working for him for 5 years, and testifying against him before the Senate Intelligence Committee in 1991, I believe that I have made some warnings about the author as well as the leading lights of the mainstream media, who believe that Gates made major contributions to the national security policy of the United States. Nothing could be further from the truth." Whether or not you agree with our speaker on this score, we are pleased to bring to our podium a man of great intellect and experience who is not shy about his views about the world around us. Mr. Melvin A. Goodman was a Soviet analyst. One sec, Mel. Let me give you your bona fides first. A Soviet analyst at the CIA and Department of State for 24 years, a professor of international relations at National War College for 18 years, served in the U.S. Army in Athens, Greece for 3 years, and was an intelligence advisor to the SALT delegation from 1971 to 1972. Currently, Goodman is the director of the National Security Project at the Center for International Policy in Washington, D.C., and adjunct professor of government at Johns Hopkins University. He has authored, co-authored, edited 7 books, including his new National Insecurity, The Cost of American Militarism, published by City Lights, and he lives in Bethesda. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Mr. Mel Goodman.
Well, thank you, Dave. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be back in Colorado Springs. I spent 2 wonderful summers here at Fred Sonderman's National Security Seminar, and my old colleague Bill Berry brought me back to the Academy in the early 1990s, so it's nice to get back again. Let me start with a story that your next speaker on Arab-Israeli affairs might be telling, but I doubt it. So maybe I'll tell it today. This deals with an event that took place about a dozen years ago, and God was looking around the world, and he thought the world was in terrible chaos. And it was time to do something drastic. So he summoned the leaders of 3 of the countries he felt responsible, not for all of the chaos in the world, but certainly for a good part of it. So he summoned George Bush, Vladimir Putin, and Benjamin Netanyahu. And he sat them down and he said, "I've got a very dire message. The world is in chaos. I hold the 3 of you responsible for some of it. I'm asking you to go home to tell your people that God has decided to destroy the world and start over again." Well, you can imagine the stunned silence in the room, but they did go home. And Bush went on national television first And he said, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is there's a God. The bad news is he's decided to destroy the world. And the next day, Putin goes on TV from the Kremlin, and he says, I have bad news, and I have even worse news. The bad news is there's a God. The worst news is he's decided to destroy the world. And 2 days later, Netanyahu goes on television, and he says, I've got good news, and I've got great news. The good news is there's a God. The great news is there will never be a Palestinian state. Please, no incoming. When Dave talked about controversy, I wasn't thinking about that story. I'm here to talk about militarism, but let me define my term to a certain extent. I'm not talking about the militarism that got us into World War I, which I think in many ways was an accidental war, or a war that a British author called made by sleepwalkers who didn't want war but ended up in a war. But to me, it's kind of interesting to remember that this was a teenager who left his home, a Bosnian Serb, to kill the Archduke in order to get an independent state for himself. I don't think he ever realized he was going to unleash the forces that would lead to this terrible, ugly, tragic war. He didn't even live to see the war end. He died of tuberculosis in an Austro-Habsburg Hungarian hospital, not knowing what he had wrought. But I am talking about the kind of militarism that Eisenhower talked about, and that's the role of the military, the important role of the military, the increasing influence of the military in national security affairs, the increased role of the military in our culture, in our movies, in our television, in our culture generally. And I start the book, National Insecurity, with 4 warnings that Eisenhower gave, and one of you know them all. It's the very famous farewell address he made in January of 1961, the warning about the military-industrial complex. Now, in 61, I was a student at Hopkins, and the president of Hopkins was his brother, Milton Eisenhower. And Milton Eisenhower used to meet with a group of us about once every 2 or 3 months. And he met with us after the farewell address, and I remember he had gone to the White House. It was never announced. He always went in a back door. And he consulted, there was a professor from Hopkins who helped write the speech. His name was Malcolm Moose. He went on to the University of Minnesota and I think became president there. And Milton told us that in Dwight Eisenhower's own hand, and remember, Eisenhower, I don't think this is understood, was a wonderful writer. He was considered the best of the military writers, and whenever George Marshall had a project, he always gave it to Eisenhower. And that's, I don't think, his public image. But in his own hand, Eisenhower had written Military-Industrial Congressional Complex. When he gave the speech, he dropped congressional. And when his brother Milton asked him about this, he said, you know, they are the problem. But taking on military and the industry is enough. I can't take on the Congress too. And that's why he dropped it. But he knew that was a major part of the problem. The second warning he gave was actually an earlier comment that he made, again, in a speech that he largely wrote that became known as the Cross of Iron speech. My regret would be that he didn't make this kind of speech more often because of the tremendous credibility he had as a 5-star general who helped to win World War II. But he made it early in his first term, and in the Cross of Iron speech, he said the degree to which we overspend on the military, which he thought we were doing, and he played a big role in cutting back that spending, we're not just spending our funds, we're spending the hopes of our children, the sweat of our laborers, and the genius of our scientists. And he talked about the cost of this military equipment, particularly if you overbuild in the military. Later in the 1950s, and Eisenhower didn't do enough about Senator McCarthy, but he did think about the problem of civil rights and liberties. And he gave a speech in which he talked about the danger of permanent war and what permanent war will do to your liberties, how it will erode your liberties. And I think in a certain way, when I look at the last 10 years of the global war on terror, where I think we have made some unfortunate decisions, we have certainly taken actions that have ignored or observed in the breach at least 4 constitutional amendments. The 4th Amendment on searches and seizures, and people may want to ask about that later. The Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment, and the battle that's going on now between the Senate Intelligence Committee and the CIA is extremely important, and I hope people are following it. It's unprecedented in my estimation. And he said that we have to control these kinds of forces. And when I think, since I was out at the Air Force Academy, talking to young people who've probably known nothing but war throughout their life, in terms of the first Iraq War in 91, right up to the present. But the final warning is the warning I want to dwell on, and that was something he didn't put in writing. It's something that Milton told our little group that I remembered and I put into the book. And Eisenhower was reflecting on his 8 years in office. This was in December or January, as he was about to turn over the government to John F. Kennedy. And he said, "God help the United States if the person who follows me into this chair does not know how to understand or deal or talk to the military." And I would argue that if you look at American presidents, for the most part, and very few have served in the military, that our presidents have been intimidated by the military or haven't known how to handle the military in all ways. I only want to talk about the 20 years that start around 1991 up to about the present. Because at that point, remember three incredible things that happened in a very short period of time that I think a lot of us didn't expect to see in our lifetime. And that was the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and all of the East European communist regimes, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I know in the war games I played, when we factored in those things, it was always in the context of violence. That we compare it, and we do think in time, we think in the past, and we remember World War I, which led to the downfall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Tsarist Empire, such as it was. We didn't expect these things to be happening in peacetime and essentially nonviolent. There was very little violence associated with any of this. Romania was terribly violent because that was the nature of the regime of the Ceausescu, husband and wife. But not a lot of violence elsewhere. So when 1989 to 1991 had these events, it presented us with a very important opportunity to honor what George Kennan had written about in his containment philosophy. Kennan is back in the news because his diary is out, and I think it's been, if not misread, I don't think it's been handled very well in the reviews. That's neither here nor there now. But Kennan was confident containment would work if we pursued wise policies, but he was also confident it would work because he thought the Soviet Union couldn't last as that kind of regime, meaning a multi-ethnic empire. Only half the people in the Soviet Union were Russians. The other half were non-Russians. I mean, there were more Slavic peoples in the Ukraine and Belarus, but only half were Russians. And he thought it would collapse. And he thought at that point, when this took place, it was extremely important to use this opportunity strategically. And the word he used was to anchor Russia to the international community. That's his word. And by that he meant bringing Russia into all of the major security architectural arrangements of the time, not necessarily NATO, but the European Union and the various economic and political organizations that existed for conducting policy in the West. Well, as we know, we didn't do that. We never really made an attempt to respond to Gorbachev's call for a common European home. We never tried to anchor, and then we took policies that I think antagonized the Russians and to a certain degree antagonized them for good reason. That there is a Russian narrative to all this that we really don't honor. So when you look at the presidencies of George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush and now Barack Obama, I think very significant mistakes were made that meant an over-reliance on the use of the military in the making of foreign policy, which is kind of unique in the world as far as the US use of the military and the wide-ranging use of the military. George Herbert Walker Bush was the first president to have an opportunity to take advantage of this dissolution of the Soviet Union. It was on his watch. But he was surrounded by extremely conservative people who I think are even more conservative than they're portrayed to be, particularly including General Brent Scowcroft, who held for at least a year and a half, held the Russians at arm's length, tried not to have arms control negotiations continued. Bush privately used to refer disparagingly to Ronald Reagan as that old man. George Bush was not a big friend of the arms control agreements that Reagan concluded in his second term. So until James Baker got into the fray, George Shultz had to do the same thing in the Reagan administration to get the president to be more active, to consider symmetry. We really try to isolate the Russians to a considerable extent. And if you look at the papers that were written, and we only know this now because some were leaked, and they came out of the Pentagon, that came from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, who was Dick Cheney at the time, and people around him, such as Douglas Feith and Scooter Libby, the same people who brought us the Iraq War, by the way. The emphasis was on unilateralism. The United States making sure that there would never be another rival or a group that would form a rivalry with the United States. And with the emphasis on unilateralism, that was an emphasis on military policy. And then the final thing that happened in the Bush administration that I think was not important in the Russian context, but important for domestic affairs, was the pardoning of the people involved in Iran-Contra. Iran-Contra was a very serious matter, as far as I'm concerned. Laws were broken. People should have been held accountable, but they weren't, and the pardoning of 6 or 7 of them, including 3 or 4 major figures at CIA, meant that we never really understood what in the world Iran-Contra was and what it was trying to do. Bush was followed by Clinton. Clinton, like so many presidents, particularly Democrats, thought he was coming into the presidency to conduct domestic affairs, not to conduct foreign policy. Clinton didn't have a great interest or even background in national security affairs, foreign affairs. He picked a very weak national security team that I won't get into, but we could discuss later. But the important thing he did, and these were 3 items, really put the United States on more of a military track, allowed the Pentagon to have much greater influence. The first thing that he did, which was extremely unwise, and we're dealing with it now, and I will get to that, the expansion of NATO. The expansion of NATO was a total gratuitous shot at Russia at this point that did not enhance American national security in any way. My wife and I did a book on Edward Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister at the time of the falling apart of the Soviet Union. And one of the stories that Shevardnadze told us that I had backing for because I'd read the memo of conversation that Baker had written, when we were trying to get the Soviet military out of Germany, remember, as Germany was marching toward reunification, the Soviet Union still had 300,000 troops in East Germany. How in the hell were we going to get them out of there? We weren't certainly going to confront them with force. And Baker sat down with Shevardnadze because Baker was truly involved in the diplomacy at this time. Just to give away my biases, Shultz and Baker were outstanding secretaries of state. We've been lacking at that position ever since, until I think now under John Kerry, but he's got a very complicated agenda. But what Baker told Shevardnadze, which I think was very revealing, it was, if you get out of East Germany, we will not leapfrog over Germany to go into Eastern Europe. That is the word he used, the word leapfrog. And of course, that's exactly what we did. And it was Clinton who started it, not for foreign policy reasons. It was even worse. It was for domestic reasons, because he was running against a Republican candidate, Bob Dole, who had made it clear in campaigning that he was going to make this issue of NATO a major issue in his campaign. So Clinton, who I think politically, that's where his genius was in terms of domestic politics more than anything else, conducted a policy of triangulation, and he cut Dole really off at the knees by expanding NATO before Dole could even make it an issue in 1996. And he brought in several key members of the former Warsaw Pact, countries like Poland. Remember, there was the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, so you had the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary. These countries from Eastern Europe were brought into NATO. But he did two other things that were damaging to our long-term ability to conduct genuine national security policy. One was bowing to the right in this country and calling for a weakening of the State Department, which meant abolishing the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. And remember, there were a lot of people in this country who were opposed to arms control. So ACTA, a very important institution, and I worked with them closely when I was the intelligence advisor to the SALT delegation in Vienna, was abolished, and we lost a lot of that expertise. And then a group that I think did very important work, they were Foreign Service officers, but they weren't in the State Department, they were in the United States Information Agency, or United States Information Service. They ran the American libraries overseas, and they explained the United States to foreign audiences and really reached out to opinion leaders. They did really good work, and I think essential work, because I think the United States is terribly misunderstood and often vilified for the wrong reasons, and USIA was trying to do something about that. But Jesse Helms was on the warpath with regard to these institutions, and Newt Gingrich had made his contract with America, and Clinton felt he had more important things to do, so he caved in to the right and abolished the two organizations, weakening that side of the national security architecture. And then finally, what Clinton did, which really isolated the United States, is to walk away from certain international agreements that the world was coming to agree to that we had no part of. And these were important institutions. These included the International Criminal Court, the ban on landmines, the ban on cluster bombs, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which I think is essential if we're going to get serious arms control. We have to find a way to do away with all testing. But there was tremendous resistance from the Pentagon, and that's the kind of militarism I'm talking about, against these treaties, and eventually he made a half-hearted effort to fight for the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but it was too little and too late, and none of these treaties and organizations got support from the United States. It reminded me in some ways of Woodrow Wilson in the League of Nations and dealing with the irreconcilables over joining the League, which we never did. So Clinton is, to me, part of the problem when I discuss what national security is all about. I don't think I have to spend a lot of time with George W. Bush. He did tremendous harm to this country in many ways that we are still trying to deal with. But certainly in terms of dealing on the international arena, the war against Iraq has to be the worst national security decision, not only in my lifetime, but I think in the history of the United States. And to do it the way he did, which undercut American credibility across the board, was basically to do it with false intelligence. This idea that, and we see it in the memoirs, I've read Bush's, Rumsfeld's, Cheney's, Rice, they all say the same damn thing. We got bad intelligence from the CIA. Well, no, they got the kind of intelligence that they wanted from the CIA, and even when the CIA wouldn't do it, Rumsfeld set up a special bureau of strategic planning under Doug Feith, and the really miserable stuff that CIA wouldn't go near, the Pentagon wrote about and sent into the White House. And they even, there was the co-opting of Colin Powell to go to the UN, something he is still apologetic about. But Powell brought it on himself. What did he do? He went out to the CIA and had Director Tenet and Deputy Director McLaughlin write his speech for him. And he was told by his intelligence advisors, the head of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, you can't go out to the CIA to have a speech written for you. You will get the National Intelligence Estimate from October 2002, which had 28 false allegations. You just can't make that many mistakes. When you make that many mistakes, it has to be intentional. It's like playing tennis with someone who's always calling the ball in one direction. He's cheating. And I think in the case of that estimate, there was a lot of cheating going on with this product. But abrogating the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty was a real setback because the ABM was the cornerstone of strategic deterrence. And he did it for the worst possible reason, which was to deploy a national missile defense, something that doesn't work. We've been working at it since the Eisenhower administration, but Bush is the first president to put it into place in Alaska and California. Now there are people who want to moved to the East Coast with it and put missile defense into Maine. We've never solved the problem technically of how do you tell the difference between a decoy and a genuine missile. The scientists I talked to, and I wrote a book on the phantom defense with a physicist, said it will never be effective in a real scenario. Barack Obama, I think, has disappointed a lot of people because of the inaugural address where he talked about not trading our liberty in for security and being more transparent, particularly in national security. He's neither fulfilled one or the other. This is one of the least transparent administrations. Greater use of the Espionage Act, on the warpath against leaks, going after journalists in a way that only Nixon had in terms of the AP and the 20 wiretaps that were used against editors and writers who were doing their job. You know, it's the job of the government to protect its secrets. So they have to enforce security in their own institutions. And Obama made the huge mistake, and I think here he was, if not intimidated by the military, too willing to accept the military argument or point of view when he conducted the surge in Afghanistan. Remember, Afghanistan has no strategic importance to the United States whatsoever. There is nothing to be gained in Afghanistan. It's an unwinnable situation. But Obama, unfortunately, had campaigned on Iraq as the war of choice and Afghanistan as the war of necessity. When he got into the White House and saw the intelligence, he knew it was an unwinnable war, and he knew it was certainly not a war of necessity. And actually, I don't know if he knows this or not, but someone should tell him that the real problem is not Afghanistan, it's Pakistan. And we're supposed to think they're an ally in this battle, but they're not. The promising thing, and I'd like to leave on some note of promise, because I realize my message, and I've been told this is rather dreary, is that the speech he gave at the National Defense University, and Bill Berry and I taught at the National War College, which is part of the NDU complex, in May of 2013, was a recognition that a permanent war must come to an end. The global war on terror must come to an end. The terrorist problem is a difficult and challenging one, but not one that requires this kind of war footing. And recently, Chuck Hagel, the Secretary of Defense, made a very important speech with regard to cutting back on defense spending. The United States spends as much as the rest of the world combined on defense. When you take the defense budget, then add in the energy budget on nuclear weapons, and add in that part of the military intelligence budget, which is 80 to 85% of the intelligence budget, you are getting close to $1 trillion a year on defense. And we can't afford this, and it cannot be justified in terms of genuine national security. In the book, I deal with what needs to be done. I don't think I need to go into any detail, and if people want to ask questions, fine. It would be very easy to take $1 trillion out over the next 10 years, and we would not sacrifice any aspect of national security. How do you justify all the military facilities we have overseas? We need the kind of BRAC we had, the Institution for Closing Domestic Bases, which was heavily politicized. We should do overseas where there won't be the great political inputs from senators who don't want to lose military facilities. See the defense budget as a jobs program for their state, whether it's Connecticut or Georgia or California, and whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. So this needs to be addressed. There has to be more emphasis on diplomacy. And really from the Clinton administration, certainly since Baker, until Kerry, who I think is in the position he should be in, and is now being vilified for his activism, for identifying the key problems as Iran, as Syria, the Arab-Israeli equation. And he's applied incredible energy, and I think in Iran he is going to be successful, as long as we can hold Iran's feet to the fire on an international basis. But we formed the International Alliance, which includes Russia and China, by the way, to make sure Iran does not develop nuclear weapons. Syria obviously was a setback for the Obama administration, but I think it's fair to point out that Assad never admitted to having chemical weapons until we threatened the use of force. And maybe Obama pulled the rug out from under Kerry, because he seemed to be on the verge of sending force into Syria, but realized he was isolated at home and abroad and changed his mind at the last minute. But do you think that Assad would have admitted to having the chemical weapons, getting rid of the chemical weapons, bringing in international inspectors, if we didn't have 4 cruisers off the coast of Syria with cruise missiles that could have created tremendous havoc in Syria? And I'm certain that Assad understood that, and I'm certain Putin understood that. And the last thing that the Russians want is some kind of Islamic regime in Syria, which is now something we're going to have to start thinking about as well. So defense cuts have to be made. Diplomacy must be bolstered. And I think what we've seen, particularly in the last 2 administrations, Bush and Obama, a decline in expertise. I notice now when the president travels and the Secretary of State travels, they are not surrounded by serious experts from the National Security Council or the State Department. There's been a terrible decline of influence and expertise at the State Department. This needs to be looked at very closely. When Nixon went abroad, I don't know why I'm using all these Nixon examples, but when you had Kissinger going into Russia, he was surrounded by people like Ehrlichman and Haldeman, who weren't experts, but were close to the president, but people like Sonnenfeld, who was a serious expert. In fact, Russians were beginning to say that the last time this many Germans came to Russia, we called it World War II. But the point was, these were planned summit meetings. We don't even have an ambassador in Moscow now, even though we knew Ambassador McFaul had plans to leave that he told the president about nearly a year ago. So I think at some point we have to realize, what is this military force for? Why do we choose to take the actions we do that involve the military? And the statement that really gave me the idea to write this book was the statement that Bob Gates started making to close friends before he announced he was going to retire. He said the United States is moving toward a smaller military that will be able to do fewer things and go to fewer places. And I thought, that's exactly the kind of military we need. Look at the Vietnam, Iraq, Afghan experiences. How many disasters do we need to take on before we learn some lessons? And finally, just to paraphrase Mark Twain to a certain extent, if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, your problems are going to start to look like nails at some point. And I'm afraid that's where we may be. So with that, I'm interested in your questions, comments, arguments. Take all incoming, as you said.
I'll repeat the question for Please, your questions, please. Sir.
I didn't want to be first, but Mel, I'm going to ask you if you would. I consider an authority. You and I go back 40 years to the Office of Current Intelligence, and I'm curious to know your opinion over our friend Edward Snowden, who got something called the Sam Adams Award last year. And I think it would be a very interesting anecdote for our audience to know who Sam Adams was and what the award means and what the implications are for security leaks.
Excellent question. Can we please hear speaker's opinion about Mr. Snowden and some information on the Sam Adams Award?
Yeah, the Sam Adams Award, that's sort of getting down in the weeds, but it's an important name, and I knew him well. Sam Adams was the intelligence analyst, a colleague of mine at the Office of Current Intelligence in the mid-late 1960s, who was an incredible researcher. He wasn't a great writer, but he was a zealous researcher. And he was convinced that the Pentagon was lying about the numbers of Viet Cong, that if we had killed all of the Viet Cong we said we had killed, why was there still a war being waged? So he went deeply into the intelligence assets, particularly from NSA, the intercept material, which is always very sensitive, and he found out there were probably twice as many Viet Cong as the Pentagon had admitted to, and there was a simple reason for why the Pentagon was fudging the figures. Lyndon Johnson had made it clear he had enough. Remember, he announced that, therefore, I'm not going to run again. And he said therefore, but there was no predicate for that therefore. And the Pentagon knew if Sam's figures were accepted as the true figures, which they were, a president would either have to get out of Vietnam or send even more troops where we had sent too many troops in the first place. So a lot of us looked at Sam because he really fought the good fight, and there are very few people who are willing to stand up to authority and tell truth to power. The moral compass in this country has really been shattered to a certain extent in terms of people who are willing to act with a certain amount of courage. But Sam did, and he fought the good fight, and he was allowed to go by the director, Richard Helms, who actually supported him for a certain extent. But he lost the battle, but clearly he was right. So the Sam Adams Award is given by a small group of retired CIA people. I am not part of it because I don't join groups. And they give an award for integrity every year. They gave an award to an Army colonel who was one of the first people, well, she was one of the first to come back from Afghanistan to tell us the truth about Afghanistan and why that was unwinnable. Edward Snowden got the award, and I'm sure his name is controversial to most of you, if not all of you. And there's a tremendous battle going on. Is he legitimately a whistleblower? A lot of people call him a traitor. When the Jonathan Pollard affair came up just recently, was in the paper, and I'm sure a lot of you followed it, Obama's willingness to release Jonathan Pollard, who sold secrets to Israel. Pollard was a traitor. That's an easy one to describe. And one of the reasons why he's been in jail as long as he has been is Israel was not the first government he approached to sell documents to. The whole idea of Jonathan Pollard being some Zionist who was trying to help out an ally, and that's used in his defense, well, he wasn't giving it to the enemy, he was giving it to an ally. You don't have allies in this field when you get to this level. He was a traitor. Snowden, I think, has some of the characteristics of a whistleblower in that when you confront a situation where you think the authority of the powers that be are being misused or being stretched, and when he saw the massive surveillance of the National Security Agency against Americans, which is a violation of the NSA's charter and the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, I might add, Snowden took it upon himself to release this information. And I know people have trouble with that. And they certainly have trouble with him running off in the wake of this. The sad thing from my lights at this point is he's probably safer in Russia than he would be in this country right now. And he knows what happened to Thomas Drake, who was a legitimate whistleblower and was charged outrageously under the Espionage Act, even though he was just a whistleblower. And a judge not only threw all the charges out of the court, but lectured the government and saying, this is not the Soviet Union. We don't conduct our affairs this way. So Snowden, on the one hand, has violated the federal laws that protect this kind of intelligence, strategic signals intelligence and communications intelligence. But we would not be having the debate that we're having in this country about massive surveillance, about the role of the NSA. How long should this information be held? Why do they need all of this metadata? The fact that we have never used this metadata successfully in the war against terrorism. It's never provided real information to battle terrorism any more than torture and abuse did. So Snowden, my next book is going to be on whistleblowing, including my own experience in going to the Hill. Snowden is a complicated matter, but again, this debate that Obama has now been a major part of, and changes are being made. The FISA court is going to have to be re-examined. It's not a genuine legal institution the way it deals with evidence and issues secret decisions made by a secret court. As Obama keeps saying, this is not the United States that we believe should exist. So that's my campaign spiel on Snowden.
Clarification, please, on exactly what constitutes the Pentagon.
Yeah, fair question. Someone once said the Pentagon has the small motor skills of a dinosaur. It is a very slow-moving, awkward enterprise, but far more complicated than I think people outside the Pentagon realize, or outside of the Washington community. When I talk about the Pentagon, I'm really talking about the civilian leadership of the Pentagon. To be fair to the military, when we talk about the misuse of force since Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, we're not talking about the military. The military was opposed to all those confrontations, had very good reasons. They wanted nothing to do with Afghanistan, for example. They didn't agree with Iraq, and particularly the way Rumsfeld had put it together, and certainly they had to be dragged kicking and screaming into Vietnam. And there was even the chief of staff of the Army who was on his way in a car driving to the White House to turn in his resignation to Lyndon Johnson when he got as far as the tidal basin, which is pretty damn close. And basically, as he said, I lost my nerve, and he went back to the Pentagon. So the wonderful book that David Halberstam did, facetiously titled The Best and the Brightest, there's your problem. It's usually the people around the president, civilian leaders, not military leaders, who have made the decisions for these wars. But once you make the decision and turn it over to the military, it's a well-trained, effective bureaucracy. And so they've been given a charge, and they carry it out, and they think it's a matter of will at some point, and they do not want to walk away from the fight. That's why you see this withdrawal from Afghanistan taking so long. The Pentagon is indeed dragging its heels, and Obama has observed that. And remember, when Obama announced the surge in December of 2009, he was criticized, and probably fairly, because in the same speech, which he gave at West Point, he went to the Academy, Army, West Point, and in the same speech he announced 33,000 troops would be going in. He also gave a date, which was a rather outrageous thing to be doing, but it showed how conflicted he was. And the inability to make the kind of decision, I'll compare him to Gorbachev. When Gorbachev came into power in 1985, one of the first things he studied was Afghanistan, and the first foreign policy secret speech that he gave that we got at CIA was the reference to Afghanistan as a bleeding wound and that we have to get out. In '87, his foreign minister, Shevardnadze, told our foreign secretary, Secretary of State Schultz, we're getting out, we're going to announce it next year. It was announced in '88. They were out lock, stock, and barrel in '89. Now, we have a far more complicated scenario because of the Pakistan problem, where, to me, that's where the problem exists. And we can get out of Afghanistan, we're going to have trouble dealing with Pakistan in the near term.
What is the speaker's take on the intelligence failure at Benghazi, and what are some of the aftermaths?
Yeah, and Benghazi was a terrible failure with serious loss of life that included the ambassador. But I wrote a couple pieces soon after Benghazi took place, and I said, my argument was you're looking at the wrong institution. It wasn't a State Department problem. It was a CIA problem. And what gave it away is when the plane went in to take those who hadn't been harmed in the attack out of Benghazi and get them to Tripoli or to Germany. There were 30 passengers on the plane, 24 were CIA, a half a dozen were State. The mission in Benghazi was a CIA mission. They were there to buy back arms that never should have been sold to Gaddafi in the first place, that now were in the hands of the various militia groups. So I think the CIA had a legitimate mission. They did not have legitimate cover, and they did not have legitimate security. I have no idea why the ambassador was there. He shouldn't have been there, particularly on the anniversary of 9/11, when all security should be heightened to a certain extent. It was certainly mishandled in Washington. On the nature of, or the issue of a cover-up, I'm not so sure, but I know that the CIA and State have gone to great measures to keep their people from talking to the press. The people from CIA who were involved in Benghazi have been polygraphed regularly up to a certain point. I don't know if this continues, to make sure they don't talk to the press. And there's a small part of the Benghazi report that's never been seen outside of official Washington that I'm told hasn't even been briefed to the Congress. ISA, my problem with ISA is he's playing politics, which I think is outrageous. I mean, Americans died in Benghazi. It's a serious matter. And he thinks he's got a political tool to use against Obama, so that's what he's doing. But there's still legitimate issues that need to be answered. And there's a recent biography out on Hillary Clinton that really didn't help. She obviously wasn't involved in the decision-making on security. That would be settled far below her level. But clearly mistakes were made. And I don't like the way it was handled in the wake of it. The briefings that Susan Rice gave as the ambassador to the UN, she had to make because all of the principals ran away from Benghazi. They basically stuck her with an explanation that she based on CIA talking points that were worded very carefully.
How would you pursue Benghazi if you were in charge?
How would you pursue Benghazi if you're in charge?
Yeah, that's all right. Well, I would not pursue Benghazi. Benghazi in itself is not a major challenge for the United States. The challenge is how do you protect Americans overseas? It's a much larger problem. So if you use Benghazi to discuss the need for more security and better security and genuine cover for CIA people, but then widen the debate. Why were all these arms sold to Gaddafi in the first place? In the book, I make a huge case against military aid. Think of the top 6 recipients of our aid, military aid. It's Israel, Egypt, Pakistan, Turkey, I forget who I'm leaving out there. Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkey, I'm missing one. But anyway, what do we get? Well, I mentioned Israel and Egypt because they're covered by Camp David agreements. They get huge amounts of aid. Israel doesn't need military aid. A couple years ago, we took them off the economic aid agenda. But if you look at Israel's military superiority over its neighbors, and you look at its economy, why in the hell are we giving $1 billion a year to Israel for military aid? Egypt, we don't have any leverage with Egypt as a result of this aid. Pakistan is not a friend. Maybe you can make a case for Turkey, but Turkey is going under some severe domestic stress, and Turkey may be a problem for the United States before too long. So I would use Benghazi to re-examine the whole area of military aid, which is really part of what Eisenhower talked about, the military-industrial complex. With the exception of Israel, everyone who takes military aid has to buy American weaponry with that aid. Israel gets special treatment. They can buy what they want to buy from whoever they want to buy it from. But that's what I would do with Benghazi. Libya may be a lost cause, so we should really go back to, is regime change a good idea? Was it smart to go after Gaddafi? The reason why I think Obama changed his mind about Syria is, what if we were successful? Assad would collapse. Then what do you have? You have even more chaos than you do now in Syria, and an Islamic, maybe fundamentalist government. So it's the absence of any strategic thinking about the consequences of actions.
What is your advice about Ukraine?
What is Mr. Goodman's advice about Ukraine?
That's a tough one. Several points, I think, need to be made. One, Crimea is over. It's done. The Russians probably regret it they ever gave it back to Ukraine anyway. They're not leaving. There is nothing we can do to get them to leave. The important thing right now is to prevent further violence, to maintain the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and to get the American-Russian relationship, which is still a very important bilateral relationship, back on track, so all those areas where we have mutual agreement can be pursued that are far more important than the issue of Ukraine. The problem in dealing with Putin now is his very limited perspective on what these actions mean, because going into Crimea was stupid. They're going to pay for it over the long run. Maybe he won't personally, but interest rates will go up, investment will go down. The oligarchs, if we get to real banking sanctions, which a move into Ukraine would bring, So we have to convince Putin it's not in his interest to move into Ukraine, but we have to convince the Ukrainians, and now because we're getting nationalism played out to a very high level, that Ukraine is going to have to acknowledge the role of the ethnic Russian community, the important role of the Russian language, and for Russians to be able to study in their own schools. This is what Czechoslovakia did for a long time until they decided to part amicably. If they part in Ukraine, I don't think it'll be amicable. And I blame the European Union for forcing the Ukrainians to make a decision of, do you go with us or do you go with them? We should have never polarized Ukraine. We should have never flirted with NATO membership for Ukraine. If you think Russians don't look at Ukraine as part not only of their sphere of influence, but as part of their nationality, the Slavic people, and remember when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was 50% of the population, but Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians were nearly 70% of the population. So they look at that as the core of the Russian culture, the Russian state. It goes back to Kievan Rus, the introduction of religion in Kievan Rus. There are these cultural ties. So Ukraine is going to have to find itself in the position that Finland was in. That, okay, they want to deal with the West, but they've got this threatening neighbor. So don't really do anything to upset the neighbor. You can still have your autonomy and conduct your policy. But you are a bridge nation, and maybe that's unfortunate, but we've taken NATO too far. And George Kennan warned us about that in excellent testimony he gave in the mid-1990s.
Is adequate protection, concern being given to the reduction of nuclear arms?
I'll get it right. No. It's a simple answer. The problem goes back really to Clinton's decision on abolishing arms control and disarmament agencies. So you took this very professional group that had spent their lives in arms control and had gotten very important arms control measures. And I think there was bowing to the pressure from the right in abolishing it. Now for Obama to get any kind of approval for any agreement, like the recent follow-on to the SALT agreement or START agreement as it's called, he had to sell out to John Kyle and others to put billions of dollars more into modernization of nuclear weapons. Look, nuclear weapons have no utility whatsoever. Unless you're on some track to destroy mankind, okay, then you can think about nuclear weapons. The most irresponsible decisions that Americans and Russians made was to build tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and we still have thousands of warheads. And we still have too many instruments of strategic power on an alert basis, and too many warheads, and too many ideas about modernization. But I think now, in the wake of Crimea and Ukraine, it's going to be impossible for Obama to make the cuts that are needed. And for everything that he does that's a step forward, he's going to have to appease a special interest. And in this case, it's going to be more modernization and more nuclearization. I thought we learned in the Cuban Missile Crisis that where we nearly came close to what could have been a nuclear exchange, that this genie's got to be kept in the bottle somehow. And it's going to take real diplomacy to do that. And I don't see this kind of diplomacy being conducted.
So the Pentagon has taken over a lot of the functions of the State Department. What will it take for the State Department to begin to take the lead again in diplomacy?
Three things. The Pentagon has to come to grips with the idea that it's accumulated far too much influence. That in the wake of the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, which few people really understand or write about, too much power was given to the military and regional force commanders. And what that did, and this is the second part of the problem, is really put into play the decline of the State Department, where American military representatives, regional commanders are far more influential when they visit countries than even assistant secretaries of state, few whose names even come to mind in the current context. Maybe Victoria Nuland, but she comes to mind because of the phone conversation that she thought she was having in private. So the State Department has to be rebuilt. And I remember there's a line that Andy Basovich uses in his useful writings, and which I find very important writings, that there are more military people marching in military bands than there are Foreign Service officers. Now, part of the problem is the State Department does a poor job of lobbying on the Hill, whereas the Pentagon does an excellent job of lobbying on the Hill, and it almost could be a model for a government agency. So until you get a State Department that's more effective in terms of management, and remember, the way they hire Foreign Service officers, and they hire good and bright people, does not necessarily translate into people who can manage the affairs of that large, unwieldy bureaucracy. So someone has to be paying attention, and I guess my argument would be go back to the National Security Act of 1947 and bring it up to date. It was written in 6 or 7 pages during the Truman administration. It was brilliant, I thought, in conception for that particular time. But now there's been too much change in the policy process, and it has to be rewritten or at least re-examined.
So if I understand your question correctly, it's how do we bring the military-industrial congressional complex into line with real budget priorities? Spending.
The problem is the problem Eisenhower identified. That's the Congress. And again, Congress, when they look at the defense budget, they see jobs program. So to be fair to the military, there have been weapon systems they've wanted to cut or abolish, and the Senate won't let them because these are systems that are built in their backyard, and there are too many jobs at stake. So at some point, it has to turn over to a special blue ribbon panel like BRAC, which did for domestic base closings, or Alice Rivlin and Senator Simpson did for looking at the deficit and the debt, because Congress, which really has the action for this, is dysfunctional. You know, we've reached a very sad point in American domestic history where there's total polarization. You know, it's stunning to think that when Medicare was passed under Johnson, who was a domestic political genius, and I think this is finally being acknowledged in this anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, a majority of the Republicans in the Senate voted for Medicare. Obama resurrected a Republican idea from the Heritage Foundation for reform of the healthcare industry, and he couldn't get a Republican vote. So that speaks to the polarization, and that's going to be difficult to deal with.
How does big money interests affect our diplomacy?
Well, the reason why these last 2 Supreme Court decisions have been very influential and controversial is because they recognize money as part of free speech. So if there's no end to the type of money you can throw into the system, it's hard to counter the influence of that industrial bloc that deals with weapons manufacture. Lockheed Martin is just too smart for the rest of us. When they build the F-35 or the F-22, they make sure that if you look at all the parts for that plane, they're built in 44 or 46 of the 50 states. They've signed up 100 senators virtually when they've done that. And if you want to see where to cut, and I don't want to get down in the weeds on this, but the idea of having 2,300 F-35s makes no sense whatsoever. And if the aircraft carrier is going to be serious in the pivot toward Asia, which I thought was mishandled, they need to recognize, as I'm sure they do privately, that China has developed very effective cruise missile technology that will keep carriers from even getting close enough to use their fighter planes against a Chinese target. So again, someone has to start thinking about these things strategically, and I just don't see it being done.
given the threat of terrorism, how do we then array our national security apparatus to provide security?
Yeah, let me divide that into two parts, because we need to talk about Afghanistan and we need to talk about terrorism before and after. The job that we needed to do in Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11, we did with 450 people. We should never forget that. 450 special forces and CIA operatives went into Afghanistan, worked with the Tajiks and some other ethnic minorities, and in 2 months we routed al-Qaeda. We possibly could have gotten bin Laden, but Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld was sound asleep at the switch and wouldn't approve the manpower that they were asking for, begging for in Afghanistan. That we needed to do, and we did it beautifully. You know, we get a lot of stars for that. Why you would take that success and build it up to 100,000 troops, the same mistake the Soviets made, all of the mistakes the Soviets made, thinking you can centralize Afghan's government, thinking that you could just fight in the major cities and therefore calm the country, and you could do it with 100,000 troops. We've made all those same mistakes. We've learned nothing. Terror is a problem, but I think it's dangerous to exaggerate the threat of terror. Terror is not going to threaten the United States. Terror is not even, I don't think, going to damage the United States in a strategic way. We took a huge hit on 9/11, but it didn't really hurt the United States in terms of our ability to use power or to be effective or viable as a governance. Al-Qaeda isn't what it was, and frankly, Afghanistan wasn't that important to Al-Qaeda. The people who trained for Al-Qaeda trained here. The money that was gotten to the Al-Qaeda people came out of Germany or from Saudi Arabia. The facilities that they had in Afghanistan were, modest is an exaggeration. So I think we've exaggerated the role of Afghanistan in the machinations of Al-Qaeda before 9/11, and in conducting a global war on terror, we raised terror to a level where it shouldn't be. It's not a military problem. It's a problem of international cooperation, international police, and international intelligence. And now we've extended the war into areas in the way we use the drone and where we're not at war, really, Yemen and Somalia and possibly Mali in the wake of Libya. And we have to really take a good hard look at the drone and drone warfare. And when John Brennan testified during his confirmation, he suggested he was going to take a hard look at that to move it into the military where it belongs and take it away from the CIA. But fortunately, since Obama's speech, and it's gone unnoticed really, we've cut way back on these drone missions. We're not running nearly as many as we had been before May 2013. It's not going to go away, but terror has been a problem with us going back to the turn of the century. How many heads of state were killed by terrorism? The problems of McKinley and how Roosevelt got into the White House. European terror, 1970s and 1980s. We've had to deal with it before, but I don't think it's going to be dealt with effectively with large armies. You're going to create more terrorists, and that's the Rumsfeld question. Are we creating more than we're killing? I highly recommend this documentary that Earl Morris has put together, The Unknown Known. I saw it last week. It really needs to be seen.
Sadly, we are quarter past the hour, just as the discussion is getting going. Disagree or agree with Mr. Goodman, we thank him for his time, and we present him with the Globe.
Oh. Thank you. Very, very enjoyable exchange. I really thank you. Good questions.